Good morning. I'm going to give you the title of my sermon today, and the title of my sermon today is Finishing Strong. And I guess you probably noticed this as well as I have noticed this, that life, a good start isn't always enough. You know people, and certainly I know people that, they started out well, but they didn't end so well, and I certainly know that that's not how I want to be, and I'm hoping that that's not how you want to be either. And we're going to talk about someone today in that very way, and we'll see how he did. Now, admittedly, a good start is a good start. I mean, we all want to at least, we want to start out good as well, but it's often not enough to get us to the finish line and or to the winner's circle. Just ask the Baltimore Orioles in 1969. I picked the Baltimore Orioles. I could have picked any story, to talk about a story about not finishing well, but I know that there was a time when the Baltimore Orioles was a really good baseball team. And back in 1969 and the early 70s, they had a great baseball team. And in fact, they actually dominated the majors really back in that time period. I mean, they won in 1969, they won 109 games, and which is a huge amount of games in any season. And they went on to be in the World Series, as you probably know. And they played the New York Mets, who hadn't won anywhere near that many games. And the first game that they played, the Orioles won that game easily, and everybody's already handing them the trophy in a sense. And, well, just 4 more games later, it would all be over, and the Mets would be the ones holding the trophy. I think that we have all probably experienced some of that in our own lives where we really thought it would end differently than it ended. But, we might have started out with a diet maybe. January 1st, everybody's going on a diet, and they start out really well with a new diet or an exercise program, or maybe there's a job around the house that they've been thinking about they wanted to do now for ages. And so they get started on that, and it all goes well at first. Whether it's the diet or the exercise or the situation at home, it all goes well at first. But as time passes by, have you noticed if you've ever gone on a diet how time passes by, the diet fades, or the exercise stops, or the project at the house just somehow it just still doesn't get done? You see, there isn't anything wrong with a good start, but it's also important that we finish. It's just not enough to start out good. I've actually spoken about King Solomon a couple weeks now, just short little parts of that, and that's how I came up with this sermon this week. And I've talked about him and how he was a king, certainly as we know. And the fact of the matter is what I said about him was true. He started out, he was a good king, or at least he started out being a good king. And I also said that after Solomon was king, Israel really went in a tailspin. I mean, they really went downhill quickly, and they finished poorly. And actually, the kingdom was split into 2 kingdoms. And I want to share with you why that happened today. Now, Solomon was a guy who learned the lesson that a good start wasn't enough, and he learned it the hard way. I mean, yes, I know that the Bible talks about him being the wisest man in the world, and at some point in time he was. But boy, he sure did make a mess of his life. He learned it the hard way for sure. Solomon definitely had a good start. And a lot of that had to do with his upbringing. I mean, he was raised by David. He was the son of David. And to be fortunate enough to be born in a family like that, as well as have a good man as your father, which David was, well, that is a good start in itself. Not everybody gets that good start. So Solomon was the son of King David, as I said, and no, David was not a perfect man. He wasn't a perfect king. He wasn't a perfect man. But who is? And yes, he made some very bad mistakes, and you could look at David's life and we could kind of judge him. But to be honest with you, God really is the only real judge, or the only real judge that matters. And here is what he had to say about David. He said, "He is a man after my own heart." Did you know that God never, ever said that about anybody else ever? He is a man after my own heart. And so Solomon, he had a good father, and he also received some good advice from David. After conquering lions and Goliath, and he conquered the evil King Saul, and he conquered the Philistines and other enemies, both foreign and domestic, David was finally facing an enemy that he was not going to be able to conquer. He was facing death. And in the book of Kings, as it opens up, David is old and he is dying, and he calls Solomon into his chamber because he knew that Solomon was going to be the next king of Israel. And so he talks to Solomon here in Kings, the 2nd chapter, verses 1 through 3. It says, "When the time grew near for David to die, he gave a charge to Solomon his son. 'I am about to go the way of all the earth,' he said, 'and so be strong. Show yourself a man and observe what the Lord your God requires. Walk in his ways and keep his decrees and commands, his laws and requirements as written in the law of Moses, so that you may prosper in all you do and wherever you go.'" Man, that sounds like good advice to me. Advice that you and I would do well to heed. Basically, it was this: observe what the Lord your God requires, walk in his ways, keep his commands, and if we will do those things, if you and I will do those things, then we will prosper. So Solomon certainly had a good upbringing. He had a good father. He had good advice. He also made a good request. After Solomon became king, he went to Gibeon to offer sacrifices to God. And that night, after the sacrifices, the Lord approached Solomon in a dream. And he said to Solomon, "Solomon, what do you want from me? If you ask for anything you want, whatever it is you want, I will give it to you." Now, if you were Solomon, what do you think you would ask for? Well, Solomon is 20 years old at this point in time, and he's having to follow in David, his father David's footsteps, which was no easy feat. So I am sure he must have felt overwhelmed, because here is his request. In chapter 3, he said this: "Now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of my father David, but I am only a little child." He was 20 years old. "And do not know how to carry out my duties. Your servant is here among the people you have chosen, a great people too numerous to count or number. So give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong. For who is able to govern this great people of yours?" Solomon is asking God for wisdom. And here is God's reply. The Lord was pleased that Solomon had asked for this, and so God said to him, "Since you have asked for this, and not for long life or wealth for yourself, nor have asked for the death of your enemies, but for discernment and administering justice, I will do what you have asked. I will give you a wise and discerning heart, so that there will never have been anyone like you, nor will there ever be. Moreover, I will give you what you have not asked for, both riches and honor, so that in your lifetime you will have no equal among kings." That's what Solomon was in the beginning. At the beginning of his kingship, at the beginning, 20 years or so old, he asked for wisdom. God gave it to him, and God said to Solomon, "There will never, ever be anyone like you." Next, Solomon performed a great project. During Solomon's 4th year as king, basically he's 24 years old, and they began the construction of the temple of the Lord. And honestly, what a project it was. It took 7 years to build this temple. And the most important part of the temple was actually called the Holy of Holies, and that was the room that the Ark of the Covenant of God would be placed in, which is where God actually dwelt back in the Old Testament days. Now, next he had a good prayer life. And I'm telling you all of these things because I'm trying to show you who Solomon really was. Next he had a good prayer life. When the building of the temple was completed, Solomon basically got all of the people together, and they had a place right there at the temple, and they were outside the temple. And when they had prayed this prayer, the priest basically withdrew from the temple, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple. You can only imagine what that must have been like. And then Solomon gathered the whole assembly of Israel in front of the temple, and he prayed a prayer of dedication. Listen to what he had to say. Solomon was a very great man at one time. Here's what he said. Then Solomon stood before the altar of the Lord in front of the whole assembly of Israel, spread out his hands toward heaven, and said, "O Lord God of Israel, there is no God like you in heaven above or on or earth below. You who keep your covenant of love with your servants, who continue wholeheartedly in your way. You have kept your promise to your servant David, my father. With your mouth you have promised, and with your hand you have fulfilled it as it is today. And then he goes on to say in verses 54, I'm not going to read the whole thing, so I'm going to the end of a prayer, but it's a credible prayer, and actually was quite long and lengthy. Here is kind of the last part of that prayer, where he says, when Solomon had finished all these prayers and supplications to the Lord, he rose from before the altar of the Lord, where he had been kneeling with his hands spread out toward heaven. He stood and blessed the whole assembly of Israel in a loud voice, saying, Praise be to the Lord, who has given rest to his people Israel, just as he has promised. Not one word has failed of all the good promises he gave through his servant Moses. May the Lord our God be with us as he was with our fathers. May he never leave us or forsake us. May he turn our hearts to him, to walk in all his ways and to keep his commands, decrees, and regulations he gave our fathers. And may these words of mine, which I have prayed before the Lord, be near to the Lord our God day and night, and that he may uphold the cause of his servant and cause the people of Israel according to each day's need, so that all the peoples of the earth may know that the Lord is God and that there is no other. But your hearts must be fully committed to the Lord our God, to live by his decrees and obey his commands. Finally, he wrote a few books. I don't know if you know it or not, but Solomon actually wrote 3 books in the Bible. 3 books in the Bible he wrote. He wrote Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Solomon. And so I think that you would have to agree that, that Solomon had a really good start. In fact, he had a great start. He was a great king. He looked like a winner. And it's because of that, really, because of that great start, that makes it so hard to understand his lousy finish. Solomon didn't finish well. Did not finish well. Listen to what 1 Kings 11, 9 through 11 says, and this is God speaking. The Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who appeared to him twice. Although he had forbidden Solomon to follow other gods, Solomon did not keep the Lord's command. And so the Lord said to Solomon, Since this is your attitude, and you have not kept my covenant and my decrees, which I commanded you, I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you and give it to someone else. And Scripture goes on to say, God goes on to tell Solomon, you know what? If it wasn't for your father David, I would tear the kingdom away from you right now. I would tear the kingdom away from you in your lifetime. You want to talk about crashing and burning. You're talking about Solomon, who God said himself, there would never, ever be another person like you, from being up there to being down here. Man, that's crashing and burning. Solomon went from being God's man to having God tear the kingdom from his hands. And the only reason really that God didn't do it to Solomon directly and at that moment was because of David. He wasn't going to do it because of David. It wasn't because Solomon had done some of these great things. Solomon couldn't say to God, in other words, that, you know what, God, I built you a temple. I mean, and it was a grand temple, incredible. It took 7 years, and he couldn't say, well, I wrote 3 books of the Bible, and he couldn't say, I've done this and I've done that for you. Doesn't that count? Those things didn't really matter now because a good start isn't enough in the eyes of God. Solomon was going down and going down hard because of his lousy finish. So why did disaster strike the house of Solomon? Well, do you remember Solomon's great prayer? 1 Kings, actually, I'll read part of it again. 1 Kings 9, verses 3 through 6 says, I have heard, this is God's reply to what he prayed. I have heard the prayer and plea you have made before me. This is God speaking to him. I have consecrated this temple which you have built by putting my name there forever. My eyes and my heart will always be there. And as for you, if you walk before me in integrity. I'll tell you before, one of the worst or one of the most difficult words in the Bible is the word but. Well, another one is if. I'll say it again. If you walk before me in integrity of heart and uprightness, as David your father did, and do all I command and observe my decrees and laws, I will establish your royal throne over Israel forever, as I promised David your father when I said, you shall never fail to have a man on the throne of Israel. Why did this disaster strike in the life of Solomon and in the life of the Jewish nation? Well, it was because they stopped following the ways of the Lord. It's as simple as that, really. That's why. But what did Solomon do that was so bad, you say? Well, actually, here's what he did. You want to know where he made the mistake? Here's where he made the mistake. Solomon began to marry foreign women. All right? He clearly had an issue with women. He had 700 wives and 600 concubines. All right? 700 wives and 600 concubines. And most of them were not followers, which means they had other gods that they didn't serve and worship Solomon's God. They had other gods. And they worshiped their other gods. And it was these wives that led Solomon away from God. I'm not placing the fault on the wives. I'm placing the fault on Solomon. It was these wives that led Solomon away. And he began to not only be led away, he began to worship their false gods. And if that wasn't enough, he began to build altars and shrines to their false gods. So how do you think God felt about that? Truthfully, most of these gods were gods that glorified sexual immorality, quite honestly. That was Solomon's problem right there. And some of them actually, they even involved child sacrifice. And he put up with it. Yes, Solomon had a great start. Absolutely true. He had a great start. He had a good father. He received good advice. He made a good request. He did some good projects. He had a good prayer life. He wrote 3 books in the Bible. But in the end, we see God angry with Solomon and tearing the kingdom from him. Why? Because he no longer walked in the ways of the Lord. He no longer walked in the ways of the Lord. I'm sure there is a lesson in there someplace, right? And actually, the Bible, the reason why all these stories are in the Bible are to teach us lessons. Listen to this verse. 1 Corinthians 10:11 says this. These things, what are these things? It's all the stories in the Bible that God has put in the Bible so that we can read them and see them and understand them. And say, I don't want to go that way. These things happened to them as examples and were written down as warnings for us. That's what it says. They were written down for warnings for us. Listen, those who fail to learn from history are always doomed to repeat it. Not only that, those who refuse to learn from the examples of Solomon and of Israel are doomed to meet the same tragic end, a lousy finish, no matter how good they started. I want to apply these lessons 2 ways today. First of all, I want to apply it to our own country. When the followers of our country came to this great nation, there were 55 men who gathered in Philadelphia at the Constitutional Convention to frame this country. In other words, to write down how it was going to be. And over 50 of them were Christians. Over 50 of them. And despite what the history revisionists claim, the ones who are trying to rewrite our history, this nation began as a Christian nation. There is no way that you can say that it did not begin as a Christian nation. I've picked out just one quote for that today. There are many and many of them that are written down that we could look at, but I only show you one. Patrick Henry said this: "It cannot be stated too strongly that this great nation was founded not by religionists, but by Christians, and not on religions, but on the gospel of Jesus Christ." Who can misunderstand that? Yes, our country had a great beginning. And our currency have on the words of, our currency actually have on the words, as you know, "In God we trust." I don't know how much longer that's going to be on there, but we still have that. And I don't know if you've ever looked at the back of a dollar bill. If you look at the back of a dollar bill, you will see an unfinished pyramid with a watchful eye over it. An unfinished pyramid with a watchful eye over it. Do you know what that stands for? That eye represents the eye of God looking out over this great nation. That's what that's about. And God is basically saying this. Yes, absolutely. You guys have started out really good, America. You have begun really well. But it's not over. And guess what? I'm going to be watching you. So why has disaster struck our great nation? I mean, disaster after disaster struck our great nation. And why has our debt gotten above our heads? And why is crime out of control? And why is our morality at rock bottom? And why is sinful lifestyles gaining increasing acceptance? And why are so many people violent and directionless and hopeless and helpless? Here is why. Because our nation has left the God that we once trusted in. That's why. That's why. Listen, our God and His Son are mocked in the media. There is no way we can say that that's not true. They are mocked in the media. They are expelled from our schools. They are thrown out of our courtrooms and ignored and ridiculed by our leaders. It's as if God is not even relevant anymore to them. It seems to me our leaders today have been fooled. They have began to believe that we got to where we are today, or at least where we were at one time, we got to be on top because of something we did. Well, the only thing that we did right was we followed God. We need to pray for our country. We need to vote in men and women who are godly if we can still find them, because in the eyes of God, a good start is not good enough. Just ask Solomon, just ask the nation of Israel. Now let's apply it to our own lives. You know, it is really easy to sit back and judge our nation and to point fingers at people and shake our heads and say, man, I can't see why they don't get it. How come they can't see? But while we do that, maybe God's watchful eye is actually just looking a little bit closer in on us. Maybe He's not just looking at just the nation. Yes, He's looking at the nation, but maybe He's looking at us and our unfinished pyramid of our Christian life, and He is saying to us, you know, I don't know why they don't get it. There are many Christians who had a great start. You know people, and so do I. They had a great start and they laid a great foundation, but a good start and a past victory doesn't make much sense when you finish lousy. It didn't work out very well for Solomon, and it won't work out very well for us either. Do you remember the advice that David gave Solomon on his deathbed? What did he tell him? Really good advice. He said, observe what the Lord requires, walk in His ways, keep His commands so that you may prosper in all you do. That is great advice still today. Great advice still today. Can I ask you, how is your walk with God today? I'm not talking about 20 years ago. I'm not talking about setting up monuments of you accomplished this or you accomplished that and you did this and you did that and I used to serve here and I used to do that. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about right now. How is your relationship with God right now? Yes, a good start is important, absolutely, but trophies are only given to those who cross the finish line. Have you noticed that there are no gold medals for the 90-yard dash? You know, the Bible is full of stories of men and women who started out great. Really, it's full of them. They all started out great, but they didn't finish so well. I think of the one in Numbers chapter 13, and I think about the 12 people who were sent to scope out the promised land. You know the story. I've told you the story before. God is ready to hand over the keys to the promised land to the newly liberated nation of Israel. They had now come over, they had walked out of Egypt, and now they're ready to go into the promised land, and God has brought them out of Egypt after 400 years of slavery. 2 million plus people, maybe 3 million people, we don't know how many people. They left Egypt with all the gold and the riches they could carry. That's how bad Pharaoh wanted to get them out of Egypt after God got done with him. And now they are ready to enter the land that God has promised them, and God specifically gives instructions to Moses to pick out 12 men, one from each tribe. 12 men, one from each tribe. And here's the thing about that. You know, we tend to think that 10 of the 12 men were bums. We tend to think of them as, why didn't you pick some better choices? Or why didn't you make some different choices, Moses? I mean, why did you pick those? Well, listen to what it actually says, though. Numbers 13, chapter 13, 1 and 2 says this. The Lord said to Moses, send some men to explore the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the Israelites. From each ancestry tribe, send one of its leaders. They weren't bums. They were one of its leaders. And it goes on to say, so at the Lord's command, Moses sent them out from the desert of Paran. All of them were leaders of the Israelites. These guys were not bums. They were actually the best of the best. They were the best of the best. They had a proven track record and a vision for the future. No, Moses was not going to go in and send out a third stringer to this land. He was going to put the ball in the hands of the very best players, and he did. He did. He picked the very best. And what also to me, it's like these guys had seen God work. I mean, they had all 12 of them had seen God work. They had seen them bring them out of Egypt. They had seen God bring Pharaoh to his knees, and Pharaoh was the strongest man in the world, the most powerful man in the world. Egypt was the greatest country in the world at that time. And God had them begging for them, the Israelites, to leave. They also saw God part the Red Sea. We've talked about that so many times. I think that the words we cannot give that enough of credence because, I mean, can you imagine? Can you imagine parting an ocean? How many gallons of water that is? They had seen all of that. They had seen God work on their behalf time after time after time. And when they went into the land that God had promised them, which again is a hard thing for me to understand, God had already promised them the land. Well, when they went into the promised land, they freaked out and they said, you know what? They're too big, they're too strong, they're too tough, we can't do it. They had forgotten everything that God had already done for them. This group of people that they had to overcome was nothing compared to Egypt. These leaders had a great start. They just couldn't finish. You see, it's endurance that determines whether or not we will finish strong. I don't know about you, I should say, but I would much rather learn from other people's mistakes than from my own mistakes because I have found that it's far less painful. So when I read about what it says in Corinthians about the fact that, these things happened to them as examples and were written down as warnings for us, I take it as a warning. David said in 1 Kings 2, 1 through 3, be strong, walk in his ways, follow him, live in his word, for this is a sure path to success. So how can we make sure that we finish strong? Very quickly is this, 4 things. Number 1, we stay. What do we stay with? We stay with his word. We look at what God has to say. All these stories in here are there to teach us the way to go and the way not to go. Listen, if you are not spending at least some time in God's Word, your chances of finishing strong are very slim. Very slim. They're not good at all. In fact, I would not, if I was a betting man, which I'm not, but if I was betting, I would not put any money on you to finish strongly. I wouldn't. Next, we stay close. We need to work on our relationship with God. You know what? I don't think there is a relationship in the world that doesn't require some work involved in it. If you want to have a good relationship, you've got to work at that relationship. And it's the exact same thing with God. We have got to spend time in his word, we got to stay close to him, and we got to stay focused. There are many, many, many things. In Solomon's case, it was women. Honestly, it was women that caused him all of his problems. I don't know what your problems or your weaknesses are, but we have got to stay focused. And the last thing was, we have got to stay away from our weaknesses. Listen, if your weaknesses is donuts, don't go to Dunkin' Donuts. Simple as that. If your weaknesses is something else, don't do that. God gives us the strength to overcome for sure. We are overcomers. We overcome by spending time with His Word. We overcome by staying close to God. We overcome by being focused and watching out for our weaknesses. Listen, we can be overcomers. We can finish strong. Give you one more time. David said, be strong, walk in His ways, follow Him, live in His Word, for this is a pure way and a good way to success. Amen and amen. Thank you, Randy.